Will the Patriotic Alliance win the colored vote in the 2024 national and provincial elections? That's the chat today. Let's talk. Spread the fire. My name is Tessa Dooms, and this is SMWX as we are in the gallop in the last stretch towards the 2024 South African elections. May 29th is the day we're all waiting for, so we can relax, we can breathe, we can know what is going to happen to the future of the country. I wanted to talk today about the Patriotic Alliance. Now, we could just talk about the colored vote because that's what comes to everybody's mind when you talk about the PA. But I first wanted to start by saying that I actually don't like the term, the colored vote. I think that there is a lot of nuance that is missing once we start to talk about colored people as one voting bloc that isn't separated. Now, that's not to say that you can't look at the number of colored people in colored communities and people who identify as colored and think about what that number represents. It's over 8% of the population. So to think about what that number of people represents is important. But to assume that all colored people will vote in the same ways is where I think we often miss ourselves in the conversation. And the PA is actually a really good story to tell about why I believe that there isn't such a thing as just a generalized colored vote, that all colored people are not the same, we don't all think the same, and we're not all voting the same. And our voting patterns as colored communities over the years has actually shown this. So I wanted to first start, before I get into the PA, by busting a few myths around colored communities and colored voters. The first is this idea that all colored people in 1994 and colored communities were voting with the National Party at the time, or the DP, or the Democratic Party. And that colored people were voting with the white establishment, I guess, at the time, and not with the progressive black movements that were coming in. I think particularly in the Western Cape, but other parts of the country as well, there are many, many examples of colored communities and colored activists who were part of the liberation struggle, who were part of the United Democratic Front, who were part of the broad progressive black movements. And I do say black movements, not to deny those people their colored identity, but because, like me, many of those people politically identify as black. So I identify as culturally colored and politically black, right? And so many of the people who I'm talking about who were activists and part of activist communities in the UDF and the liberation struggle as a collective were part of a broad black liberation struggle that was fought across communities. And many of those communities, even today, and those people in those communities, even today, do not vote inside what you think of as strict color lines or even community cultural lines. There's a diversity of thought within the colored community that has always been present. In fact, a community like Wentworth in KZN, as probably one of the bastions of black consciousness thinking. Steve Biko himself is said to have spent a lot of time in the community of Wentworth. And if you go there, it's undeniable how politicized the community has been, is, and the different strains of politicization in that community. And I think that the second part of the story about colored communities has also got to do with religion. And you'll see that within colored communities, there's a strong pull towards religion. I was raised, for example, in a Christian community, in a Christian church, and that played a big part in terms of my political thinking. In fact, it was part of the reason I wasn't very politically conscious. However, in Muslim communities within colored neighborhoods, there was always a strong kind of identification with politics. And so you saw Muslim parties over the years have done really well in colored communities on the basis of religion. So a party like Al Jamaa, for example, doesn't get thought of as a colored party. However, a lot of colored communities and people in colored communities who are Muslim would vote with Al Jamaa over the years. So many people don't track why Al Jamaa has stayed or has been entered into the political realm and has stayed relevant with seats. without thinking about where those votes are coming from, and particularly pointing out that many communities that are Muslim are also colored. Then the third part of colored voting trends is a kind of shift away from and grappling with the question about particularly a party like the Democratic Alliance. And that party has had its relationship with the colored community in various settings tested. So the Western Cape has gained from colored voters, absolutely. I know the community that I'm from, Eldorado Park, has voted in DA councillors often and has voted with the DA many times broadly in our community. However, that's usually been about looking for a party that resonates with the idea of feeling unseen, unheard, and being a minority in society. So colored communities are often thought of as a minority and part of minorities, and therefore this kind of affinity with minority parties is not hard to imagine why the DA would be able to speak to a group like that. Even the FF Plus at times, depending on where you are, is starting to be able to attract colored voters, not on the basis of just being colored, but being part of minority groups looking for representation in a new form of majority, a new form of majority that many colored people do not feel seen or heard by or represented in. And I guess the last part of it is my evidence that there isn't one colored vote that particularly is swung by the idea of colored people will only vote for colored people is Patricia de Lille. If it was true that all colored people vote the same, and that particularly colored people only vote for colored people or are swayed by voting for a colored person, Patricia de Lille would be the mayor of Cape Town on her own steam without having gone to the DA. She would definitely have had chances of being Premier of the Western Cape by now. But that's not the way it works. The math shows us and the statistics shows us that the colored vote isn't a unitary vote, isn't a simple vote, and isn't simply a vote for a colored person. Now, all of that being said, the PA has become a big part of the conversation around colored voting, colored communities, and the question about how the PA has become a bigger party has been answered very simply as the colored community is voting for a colored Gayton McKenzie. I want to dismiss that, but I don't want to do it in isolation of talking about the broader Patriotic Alliance story, which I want to focus on for the rest of the show. So let's try to understand the Patriotic Alliance before we get to this 2024 election, where I think the Patriotic Alliance is going to have its big breakthrough moment nationally and provincially. Contrary to what's in our popular imagination, for the majority of us who think of the PA and talk about the PA as one of the newcomers, a new party, an emerging party, a party that's breaking through. However, this is the Patriotic Alliance's third national and provincial election in 2024. They are a 10-year-old party, more than 10 years, in fact. They were established in November of 2013 and contested their first elections, of course, then in 2014. And at the time, it's important to think about the context in which they come up, right? They come up in the wake of the EFF having just been launched. The EFF's launch signaled a new generation of breakaway voters from the ANC, particularly young voters, because Julius Malema and Floyd Shivambu particularly came from the Youth League of the ANC. And they came with branches of the ANC Youth League. And so that new wave of breaking away from the ANC. But also part of the EFF moment and that 2014 election was also the Marikana massacre. And so working class communities and the ideas around working class politics were very much formed on this question about the Marikana massacre, the place and the position of workers in our society, and a politics that spoke to the working class very particularly. Now, Gayton McKenzie and Kenny Kunene at that time are anything but working class heroes. In fact, they are on the come up. Having recently, Gayton had recently come out of jail and had done a big tour of kind of his jail experiences and his rehabilitation into society, and had been going to communities and has been speaking to people and young people in particular about gangsterism, jail, and social ills. And so he's molding himself into a kind of social activist at the time. But the news stories about Gayton and Kenny Kunene, the things that were making him famous, both of them famous, in fact, were more about sushi than they were about rehabilitation from jail. So anybody who knows what I'm talking about is having a bit of a giggle now, because you know that Kenny Kunene was known as the sushi king, and Gayton McKenzie and Kenny Kunene were living very flashy lives at that point, and were really known for being flashy, spending lots of cash, all of those kinds of things, and then had also this history of jail just very recently. And as we all know now with the Jacob Zuma case, that Gayton McKenzie would not have been able to stand for parliament until 5 years after his sentence had been completed. So he's also coming off the back of that. But they're definitely not catching the zeitgeist of the moment in the country that is speaking to a working class voter, that is speaking to the issues of big companies and elites and political elites that are not only alienating working class voters, but literally and in all ways oppressing and even killing, in that case. With the Marikana massacre, you saw the death of working class people. And that's the moment in which the PA enters, with these big personalities that are known more often than not for being flashy and cashy, right? And so I don't think at that point they were figuring for what kind of audience they were going to attract. I think there was a conventional wisdom that was used, that big personalities, big celebrity, and a large following would translate into votes if people went into the political sphere. And this is pre the Donald Trump era of the world as well. Because Donald Trump, I think, was an education in how to move from celebrity into politics and move your following from celebrity into politics. But we even pre the Donald Trump era. And so people don't really know at that point how to do that move and how to make that shift. And so I think that they went very zealously into the 2014 election, thinking that their popularity and their ability to get media attention and having cash, having money on their side, would get them the vote. In that 2014 election, they got 0.06% of the vote and weren't able to secure any seats in parliament, in legislatures, nothing. And I will give credit to Gayton McKenzie and Kenny Kunene for not giving up at that point. Most people running in an election at a first hurdle, falling at that point, not getting anything, would probably have walked away, especially given the kind of standing and the kind of popularity and sway that I think they really knew that they had in popular culture that they hoped would translate. But I think what they've done is a learning journey that tells us some lessons that we can learn about the South African electorate and politics in South Africa. Now, I want to get into those lessons that I think we can all learn from, but particularly new and emerging parties can learn from. But I do want to isolate one thing about the PA and what they've taught me, is that politics requires, as the core ingredient to enter it, courage. It requires the courage to raise your hand, the courage to back yourself, and the courage to do hard work and hard yards for a long period of time. And, you know, we all have gotten into a very instant porridge version of politics in South Africa. You know, you just add water. That's what we want. We want not only perfect politics, but we want that perfect politics to be instant. It must just pop out of the bag. People want you to just pull out a political party out of your back pocket, and it's supposed to just fit perfectly into the South African society and jump and just go, right? But that very, very rarely happens in South Africa. I would say it never happens in South Africa. Now, one might say, well, Cope did it. Cope got 1.3 million votes in 2009 in 6 months of electioneering. The EFF did it, almost getting to 1 million votes in their first election in less than a year. And now we are seeing the emergence of MK. But what all of those parties have in common with each other is that they were breakaways from a big party machinery like the ANC, that they were bringing with them not only personalities from the ANC, not only some of the talking points or policies that they were punting within the ANC, but also some of the constituents and organizing power from the ANC. And even if you think about it on the side of the DA, with a party like Action SA, which in its first showing in 2021 did quite well, Herman Mashaba wasn't just coming at it as a novice. He was already now in the political system. He had been mayor under the DA's watch, and he was bringing with him some political machinery and people who had worked political machinery, like Michael, who is their chairperson. So they were coming with previous experience and previous political machinery and organizing power. So the PA has had to learn the lessons of how to build those things over time. They've had to build ground up. And you have to respect that they actually did that work, that they actually did the work of figuring out how to build a movement ground up, putting their hands in the air when people would have thought them unlikely to be good politicians because of their histories and because of their past. Deciding to back themselves and having the courage to form an organization and continue to contest in the face of people pushing back, people saying that they're not the right kind of people, and people saying they don't have any kinds of politics. If we are going to do anything in our society, taking it forward, we definitely need more people to come from outside of politics into politics. We need more people who have the courage to say, I'm not a conventional politician. I don't intend to be a politician. I don't want to be a politician for the rest of my life even. But I am willing to raise my hand and contest political space and political power and do the work in order to get there. I think there's a lesson just in that we will, the people who will lead us into the future are not necessarily the ones we prefer, but they will always be the ones courageous enough to actually pick up the baton, start the work, and do the work to build the kind of politics that they believe in, even if it's not the politics that everyone believes in. So, now that we've done a bit of the backstory, there are 5 lessons from the Patriotic Alliance that I think that teach us something about the South African political scene, but also can be a lesson to parties who are coming into the political arena. So your BOSAs, your African Political Organization, Rise Mzansi's, all of these organizations coming in, Action SA. What do we learn from an organization that has been on the journey for 10 years, right? So there are 5 lessons. And the first lesson is really that you just have to start and keep going. You cannot set yourself targets and then when you don't meet the targets that you've set, just give up. You have to keep going and set a long-term plan to be a part of the political scene for a long time. I think that had they not set themselves a long-term plan and had the fortitude and the courage to fail and fail and fail until they succeeded, we wouldn't have a Patriotic Alliance today. And I think that that's an important one. But the second one is the reason why I think in the last 4 years, particularly, the Patriotic Alliance has done better, much better than it did in the first 6 years of its existence. And I'll remember this moment very clearly, the moment that I first realized that the Patriotic Alliance was a different organization than it had been before. It was about February or so in 2021 when I read about a councillor called Peter Rafferty in Eldorado Park who had switched over from being DA to being Patriotic Alliance. And I remember tweeting about that move and saying that everybody should keep their eye on the Patriotic Alliance from this point forward and not underestimate them. Because I knew Peter Rafferty at that point. I had done some work in the Kliptown community where he was councillor and had an office in Kliptown, and he was a DA councillor. And we'd had a few interactions, but it wasn't my interactions with Peter Rafferty himself that made me perk up when he moved to the PA. It was the way people in the community spoke about Peter Rafferty and how much they trusted Peter Rafferty. And it was interesting because it wasn't even DA voters who were talking about this councillor. It was people who were not voting, disillusioned, disenfranchised voters. It was people who were voting ANC, and it was people who didn't identify as colored particularly as well, who were saying that Peter Rafferty is the kind of community leader and politician that they trusted and respected. And so when he made that move, he immediately lost his seat as a ward councillor. He resigned as ward councillor and decided to trigger a by-election in February. This is 2021. There's going to be an election, a local government election, of course, the end of that year. But he decides to trigger a by-election by resigning and coming back as a mandated PA councillor to take up that same ward seat. So he basically resigns from the seat and then contests it immediately again, but wants to contest it so that he can do it in the bright green colors of the PA and make this political statement that he's moving. And his constituency move almost wholesale with him. Peter Rafferty had no problem winning that seat. Nobody else had a chance. He won that seat outright. And so this move made me start asking, what is the PA doing differently? Why have they gone for a Peter Rafferty? And this became clear in other parts of my community, Eldorado Park, as I started seeing more and more PA support. That the PA was identifying existing community leaders and inviting them to join politics through the PA. That was the model that they were going for. So there was another big example in the context of Eldorado Park that I know well. And that was Ashley Souls, or Umbiza, as he's known on the social media streets. Ashley, I've known all my life, actually. I've known because we were both youth leaders in Aldos over 20 years ago. And so when Ashley, he was a pastor at the time, when he decided to start contesting in politics under the PA, that's when it clicked for me that this is how the PA is building itself now. That it is not imposing a Gayton, a big figure, onto a community. That what it's actually doing is embedding itself into the community through community leadership. And that's the second big lesson, is that if you're going to build a political party and you're going to build constituents, you actually have to be in the community, present in the community, and not only show up every 5 years. I think where the DA has done itself a great disservice as a political party is that it's not the kind of party that you feel the impulse of on a day-to-day basis in communities that vote for it. And I can say that having lived in Eldorado Park, where many people have voted DA, that the DA felt for me like a party that came in and out. When it was election season, it was there. When it wasn't. And maybe there are other DA constituents that feel like they're serviced in between elections a lot more. I just didn't feel that in the community that I'm closest to that was voting DA. But there was something about embedding oneself into the fiber of the community and the fabric of the community and having prominent community leaders endorse the party but also stand as leaders in the party that made the party almost immediately a wholesale part of the community and made the party a viable option for the communities. I would almost say that embedding itself into communities has caused the PA to grow through word of mouth. It hasn't grown through, big campaigning and big rallies. It's grown through whispers in the community. And that's what you need to do if you're going to build a political party in South Africa, especially in the climate we are in today, is you need to be able to be, trusted by the community. So I often think about this in terms of how you build trust in communities by looking at the COVID example, right? So COVID-19, we had a lot of misinformation about COVID just going out. Lots of videos and things that were popping up. And the things that people trusted the most, especially when it came to vaccines, was less what the president was saying at family meetings on television in a tie, and more what you were getting on a WhatsApp group from a family or a friend that you knew or trusted. And so that's the way that we build trust. We take information more easily from people who we know than people who we don't know. And when you don't know politicians, you are not going to trust them. My father in 2021, he was almost 80 at the time. It was the first time he didn't vote since 1994. And I asked him why. And he said, I don't know these people. That was what he said was the main reason why he couldn't find someone to vote for. And I think knowing the people who you are voting for, knowing that you have access to those people, knowing that those who are saying you should vote for them are trusted people in your own life, does help you engage better politically, build trust politically. And I think they did that particularly well. And you can see the difference that it made in their electoral performance. It's a very stark difference. In 2016, the PA contests municipal elections and only gets 20,000 votes across the entirety of the country. Literally less votes than they got in 2014, right? But by 2021, they have 10 times that amount of votes. They have 260,000 votes by 2021. And so the strategy paid off of embedding themselves in communities, especially with a municipal election. If you're thinking about the fact that communities are voting now for ward councillors, for individuals, and that's something we also don't use a lot in politics in South Africa. The idea of voting for the individual that is in your community. When we think about individual politics, we're thinking about the big man. And I'm going to get to that now in terms of the lesson from the PA. But here you had people voting in their communities for people in their communities. And that was, I think, the inflection point for the Patriotic Alliance that gives them the best chance possible now in 2024. And that leads me straight into my third lesson, is that South Africans are not as interested in big man politics as we think they are. Now, I know you're shouting Jacob Zuma into the screen right now as you hear this, but I have a case to make here. That in fact, it is the party that makes the man or the woman, rather than the woman or man that makes the party. And that parties that center themselves just on one individual are often weaker than those that build a organizational structure, machinery, and a brand that is bigger than the individual. So the ANC is the best example of this, right? When we think about the ANC, one of its greatest strengths is that it has multiple ways in which people engage it and multiple people that draw, that draw people to the ANC, draw voters to the ANC. I often in communities when I listen to ANC voters, and I think I might be in the minority of us who actually listen to ANC voters. It's an important thing to do, to not just dismiss ANC voters as irrational, is one of my greatest political decisions, but to listen to them. And when you listen to ANC voters, you will hear people say, I vote ANC because of the people who live in my community, because the people who are in my neighborhood. I vote ANC because the mamas who come and peel potatoes there at my funeral. They're not voting ANC for Mandela. And I know that that's what we all think, that it's Mandela's party. And even if it is a big man, it's probably a different big man or big woman than you might imagine. For some people, there's an affinity to a Walter Sisulu or a Oliver Tambo particularly. For other people, it's an affinity to Winnie Mandela. And so there's this range of different people that people have an affinity to that represent different parts of the politics of this broader organization. But also, there's a very real belief within an organization like the ANC that no one is bigger than the party. And you see it now in this MK moment, where Jacob Zuma, in a very short space of time, went from somebody that the ANC would go to bat for to somebody that the ANC will now distance themselves from if it brings harm to the organization. And so making sure that the party and the brand and the organization is bigger than any one individual gives strength to political parties in South Africa rather than a weakness, right? And I think that lesson was something that, whether intentionally or unintentionally, Gayton McKenzie and Kenny Kunene learned, and they latched onto it. And they took a hiatus, as it were, from centering themselves in the political party. They weren't the big faces or the big names for a good few years. They made sure that they pushed forward other people. They gave opportunities for local people to take on mayorships and to take on roles and MECs. They didn't take on those roles immediately at the first instance. They created a sense that the party is bigger than two people. And that matters in South Africa. I mean, we are now in the short stretch towards the election, and we're seeing more and more rallies, what we call stadiumology, the filling up of stadiums. I personally am not a fan of the idea of filling up stadiums, but I do understand that filling up stadiums is a message to the voter that they and their vote are not alone. They're not voting into a party that has nobody else voting for it. It gives those images of we are part of a collective that is greater than ourselves. And that speaks both to part of our community sensibilities as African people, and it speaks to our political sensibilities as people of resistance and protest and struggle. We do these things together. Our politics is very much a collective thing. It's different from the US, where you can think of one individual person and not even know anything about their party and their party's ideals really, but just be attracted to that individual superstar. That's not the way South African politics really works. And the MK party even is an example of that. Yes, having a Jacob Zuma at the helm of the MK party greatly gives it political capital, but it's not the only thing. The reason why the party is called Mkonto Wesizwe is to bring that history of the ANC, that brand of the ANC, and also put it on the table as part of the offering. It's also to bring Jacob Zuma there as an ANC man, a man who's singing the ANC songs, who has the struggle credentials. He's not just a guy from Nkandla. That's not who they're putting forward. They're putting forward a political man of the ANC that is saying that he's going to protect the ANC heritage and legacy through Mkonto Wesizwe. That's part of the power and the allure of having Jacob Zuma as part of MK, not just the man himself. And so it's not a cult of celebrity in a very clean and clear sense. There's a lot of nuance to it. And I think learning to take that step back that the PA did and not trying to just create this big man, I think was part of the reason why they're seeing the kinds of growth that they've seen in the organization and their brand that they're seeing right now. So the fourth big lesson that you learn from the Patriotic Alliance is to build an organizational culture and build organizational structures. So the organizational culture of the PA, I again first picked up on very organically watching the PA. And not only kind of their uniform in the sense that they were really wearing their T-shirts and their regalia. And that's a big deal in South Africa. T-shirts matter in South Africa. You know that a party is getting traction when somebody's wearing their political T-shirt on a random Tuesday to go to the mall. You know, when they have that level of pride and identity and attachment that they're starting to wear those political T-shirts even when they don't need to, that's when you know something is really forming when it comes to small parties or new parties, I guess, in the South African landscape. But what they actually started doing that I thought was really important and really interesting was they started doing kind of community-based activism. And so community-level engagements and community-level initiatives. And so that became part of the culture of getting people into the PA, was that they were showing up for community activism. I think that was a really important turning point for the organization. And then the other thing was just something very small but important. The PA has its own amandla. And it's a fascinating thing once you hear it for the first time, because you start realizing that that call and response, when somebody says amandla in the ANC or in political spaces, and that immediate response is awethu, that ability to do that call and response, the PA has in the word salute. Very, very small thing, but it gives a particular identity and a sense that there is a culture here, that there's a collective sense of personhood and identity that people have. And then also just hosting very small gatherings, very particular gatherings in communities where they are at. speaking in the languages of the majority of their constituents, who still happen to be majority colored constituency, but not solely colored constituents. And so you will see in the kind of language, the slogan, Ons Baizani. I mean, anybody in a township in the south or the west of Joburg, whether you're in a colored township or not, when you hear Ons Baizani, there's just a familiarity to it. And so that localizing of the politics and embedding it into the culture as well, I think has helped the PA a lot, getting into the public's imagination. Politics isn't just about getting into the minds of people. It's also getting into the hearts and through the eyeballs of people. And I think the PA has worked on the heart part a little bit more than they're given credit for in general, especially because there's this focus on the very wild, sometimes loud things that Gayton McKenzie says. Things that are provocative, things that are, that are going to be controversial. Those are the things that Gayton McKenzie uses to get eyeballs. He's winning the eyeball battle by doing those kinds of things. But if you spend time with organizers and members of the party, there's a lot of difference in views in the PA. Everybody's not got the same exact view. And I think that also is testament to the idea that it's not just about big man politics, and not everything Gayton says is seen as valid and truth and fact, but that there's something else that binds people together in that ecosystem. And I think it is about community and culture. And I think if you're going to build a political machine in South Africa, you need to build community and constituency and culture, not just a loud campaign or big man politics. You don't just need a person, you need an organization. So the fifth lesson is about taking stances, taking positions. For better or for worse, whether you're right or wrong, take positions. I remember the days of the Mbeki presidency. One of the things I came out of the Mbeki presidency feeling like, I didn't always agree with Mbeki, but I always knew where he stood on issues. I could debate those issues. I could say whether I agreed or I disagreed on the issues that came from that president and his presidency. And so I think South Africans have the ability and have always had the ability to be quite nuanced and quite robust in engaging with the issues. You don't have to get it right the first time. And I think somehow we've become quite timid in our politics when it comes to taking positions. The political leaders and the political parties that stand out are those who take positions, even if those positions are wrong, because then you are willing to be accountable even in your wrongness. And I think we must encourage political parties to take positions, to take stances, to be willing to be wrong, to be willing to be engaged by the public, and to also be willing, and we must have a willingness to allow people to change their minds. That if a politician says something we disagree with, and we then push back and convince them otherwise, that if they change their mind, that we then applaud their ability to change their mind. It's not a one or done. It's not the first time you say something is the last time you're going to say something. Julius Malema has been called a flip-flopper. Every now and again, this idea of a flip-flopper comes about. And, there might be merit to him not being consistent on issues. But there's definitely room to be able to change your mind on issues and say that you now do not agree with yourself from a few days ago or years ago or weeks ago, because you've been convinced by your constituents, you've been convinced by your opponents, you've been convinced by new political ideas. Politicians can't be held to the things that they said 5 years ago just because they're now saying them publicly. They have to be able to be given the space to change their minds. And as the polity, as the voters, we also need to create that space for politicians to be wrong but engaged, to be wrong but challenged, and to be wrong but change their minds. I think that all of that has helped the PA get a kind of traction that we have taken for granted, that we've all just chalked up to either Gayton being loud or colored people being gullible. I don't think that's the story of the PA. I think the story of the PA is one of a party that has, over a 10-year period, learn some political lessons. Is it a perfect party? No. Is it a party everyone agrees with? I don't agree with most of the things that the PA says, but that's not the measure of a good party. It's not whether everyone agrees or everyone takes its side or it is appeasing to everyone. It's whether or not it's able to build a coherent sensibility and a coherent place in the South African society. And I think that this election will be the final proof point about whether or not the PA is here and here to stay. So I think that sums up my view, and I hope that as we go into the next week or so of this election, that we'll pay attention to emerging parties and be able to measure them on much more than their slogans and much more than whether they have superstars and whether or not they're really parties that are in it for the long haul. Yeah. Let's spread the fire until the 29th of May.